In the unforgiving world of the Chicago underworld, a bullet costs $1, but a loose end costs you your empire. Lorenzo Costa, the ruthless head of the Costa crime family, never left loose ends. But when he caught a terrified plus-size cleaning woman witnessing his latest execution, he made a fatal error. He felt pity. He took her in, expecting her to be nothing more than a pathetic, invisible ghost in his sprawling mansion. He thought he was saving her life. He never expected that when his own men turned their guns on him, the heavy, ignored girl he pitied would become the only human shield keeping him alive. The bass from the main floor of the Velvet Room vibrated through the soles of Beatrice Gallagher's worn-out sneakers. It was 3:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, the hour when the glamour of the high-end nightclub peeled back to reveal the grime underneath. Beatrice, carrying a mop bucket of bleach and hot water, hauled her 260-pound frame down the dimly lit VIP hallway. She was sweating. She was always sweating. The heavy polyester uniform the club provided was at least 2 sizes too small, pinching her waist and making every breath a conscious effort. Society had a way of treating fat women like Beatrice. They either stared with blatant disgust, or they looked right through her, as if her sheer mass made her entirely invisible. Beatrice preferred the latter. Being invisible kept her employed. It kept her safe. Until tonight. She pushed her heavy cart toward the double mahogany doors of the manager's office. She was supposed to clean it before 4:00 a.m. Assuming the room was empty, as it always was at this hour, Beatrice pushed the door open. The smell hit her first copper and burnt cordite, sharp and sickeningly sweet, cutting right through the fumes of her bleach. Beatrice froze. The bucket slipped from her trembling, damp hands, hitting the plush carpet with a dull thud, water sloshing over the brim. In the center of the room, kneeling on a plastic tarp, was Tommy Flynn, a local mid-level dealer. Or at least it used to be Tommy. Half of his face was a ruined mess of crimson and bone. Standing over him, lowering a suppressed 9mm pistol, was a man whose face had dominated the local news and the whispered nightmares of the city, Lorenzo Costa. Lorenzo was a striking man in his late 30s, possessing the kind of sharp, aristocratic Italian features that looked like they belonged on a Roman coin. His charcoal-bespoke suit was immaculate, completely at odds with the brutal violence he had just committed. Behind him stood 2 massive enforcers, their faces entirely devoid of emotion. At the sound of the spilling bucket, 3 heads snapped toward the doorway. Beatrice's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat, as a cold, paralyzing terror washed over her. She couldn't run. Even if she tried, her heavy legs wouldn't carry her fast enough to outrun a bullet. "Boss," one of the enforcers, a scarred brute named Leo, growled. He raised his own weapon, pointing it squarely at Beatrice's chest. "We got a rat." Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears instantly spilling over her round cheeks. She brought her pudgy hands up to cover her face, a childish instinct to hide from the monsters. She waited for the crack of the gun. She waited for the burning impact. She thought of her cramped, lonely apartment. She thought of how long it would take her landlord to find her body. "Wait," a voice commanded. It was smooth, dark, and dangerously calm. Beatrice peeked through her trembling fingers. Lorenzo Costa was walking toward her, his polished leather shoes leaving faint, dark impressions on the wet carpet. He stopped inches from her. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. Lorenzo stared down at her. He analyzed the terrified, violently shaking woman. He saw the cheap, ill-fitting uniform. He saw the tear-stained, flushed cheeks, the messy bun of brown hair, and the sheer undeniable reality of her physical form. In the ruthless ecosystem of the Mafia, only predators and useful prey survived. Beatrice was neither. She was, to his eyes, utterly pathetic, a harmless, heavy-set cleaner who probably went home to a microwave dinner and a cat. Killing a rival was business. Killing this terrified, helpless woman felt entirely different. For the first time in a decade, a strange, uncomfortable sensation tightened in Lorenzo's chest. Pity. Leo put the gun down. Lorenzo ordered his dark eyes, never leaving Beatrice's face. "Boss, she saw the whole thing," Leo argued, taking a step forward. "Rules are rules. No loose ends." "Look at her, Leo," Lorenzo said coldly. "Does she look like a threat to you? Does she look like she's going to run to the feds? She's a ghost. Nobody even knows she's here." Lorenzo reached out his leather-gloved hand, gripping Beatrice's chin, forcing her to look him in the eye. He could feel her pulse racing violently beneath his thumb. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Beatrice." She stammered, her voice a pathetic squeak. Please. I didn't see anything. I swear on my life. I'm just the fat cleaning lady. I'm nobody. Please don't kill me." Lorenzo's expression remained unreadable, but the grip on her chin softened slightly. "You're right, Beatrice. You are nobody. And if you want to stay alive, you are going to belong to me now. If I let you walk out that door, my enemies will find you, torture you, and put you in a barrel. Or my own men will put a bullet in your back just to be safe." He dropped his hand. "Leo, take her to the estate. Put her in one of the guest rooms in the East Wing. She doesn't leave the grounds. Ever." "Boss, are you serious?" Leo asked, bewildered. "You're taking in a stray. I made my decision." Lorenzo snapped the dangerous edge, returning to his voice. He looked back at Beatrice. "You live at my house now. You breathe because I allow it. Do you understand?" Beatrice could only nod violently, the tears flowing freely as her old invisible life vanished in the blink of an eye. She was dragged out the back door of this club, shoved into the back of a tinted SUV, and driven into the dark, terrifying unknown. The Costa estate was less of a home, and more of a fortress. Nestled on 40 acres of private woodland outside the city limits, it was a sprawling mansion of dark stone, wrought iron, and high-tech security. For the first 3 weeks, Beatrice lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing anxiety. She was given a luxurious bedroom in a wing of the house that rarely saw foot traffic. Her wardrobe was replaced by an uncomfortable selection of high-end tailored loungewear that Lorenzo's assistant had haphazardly ordered in her size. She felt like a hippopotamus stuffed into silk. The staff and the armed guards treated her exactly how she was used to being treated, with a mixture of contempt and complete dismissal. They whispered about her in the hallways: the boss's new pet, the fat stray, the charity case. Lorenzo himself practically ignored her. He was a phantom in his own home, leaving early in the armored convoys and returning late at night, often smelling of cigar smoke and copper. Beatrice quickly learned the rhythms of the house. She learned how to stay out of the way, flattening herself against the walls when the heavy-shouldered enforcers stomped down the corridors. Her only solace became the mansion's massive industrial-grade kitchen. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the guards were patrolling the perimeter, Beatrice would creep downstairs. Baking was her therapy, the precise measurements of flour and sugar, the rhythmic kneading of dough. It grounded her. It was the only thing in her chaotic new reality that she could control. One Tuesday night, a storm was raging outside, rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beatrice was standing at the marble island, wearing an oversized apron, furiously aggressively mixing a bowl of chocolate chip cookie dough. "You're making a mess." Beatrice gasped, nearly dropping the heavy ceramic bowl. She spun around. Lorenzo was leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen. He looked exhausted. He was wearing a dark silk robe over his trousers, his tie undone, dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes. There was a fresh, angry red cut along his jawline, and his knuckles were bruised and split. I'm sorry, Mr. Costa," Beatrice stammered hurriedly, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron. "I couldn't sleep. I'll clean it up right away." "Leave it," he said, walking slowly into the kitchen. He moved like a predatory cat, graceful but weary. He pulled out a bar stool and sat down heavily at the island, directly across from her. He stared at the bowl of dough. "Are those going in the oven?" "Yes, sir." "Bake them. I'm hungry." Beatrice nodded quickly, scooping the dough onto a baking sheet with trembling hands and sliding it into the commercial oven. The silence in the kitchen was thick, oppressive. Lorenzo simply sat there watching her work. It made her skin prickle. She was hyper-aware of her size, the way her hips bumped the counters, the way her arms jiggled as she moved. She expected him to make a cruel comment, to mock her weight the way his men did when they thought she couldn't hear. Instead, he spoke quietly. "Why aren't you terrified of me anymore, Beatrice?" She stopped wiping the counter and looked up at him. The initial blind panic had faded over the weeks, replaced by a dull, aching resignation. "I am terrified of you," she said honestly, surprising herself. "But you're not going to kill me tonight. You wouldn't ask me to bake cookies if you were going to shoot me." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched Lorenzo's lips. Logical. 10 minutes later, she placed a plate of warm, gooey cookies and a glass of cold milk in front of the ruthless Mafia Boss. He ate in silence, devouring 3 of them before leaning back and letting out a long sigh. "You're very quiet, Beatrice," Lorenzo noted, swirling the milk in his glass. "You wander around my house like a shadow. You hear things. You see things." Beatrice swallowed hard. "I don't look at your business, Mr. Costa. I mind my own." "You underestimate yourself," Lorenzo murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "People like you, people who the world decides to ignore, you become the best observers. Because no one is watching you, you get to watch everyone else. Tell me something you've seen." Beatrice hesitated. She knew the golden rule of the underworld was to keep your mouth shut. But she also remembered the way she had seen Victor Lorenzo's handsome, overly charismatic second-in-command looking at Lorenzo's private safe in the study a few days ago. "It's probably nothing," Beatrice murmured, picking at the hem of her apron. "Tell me," he commanded, his tone hardening. "It's Victor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looks at your chair when you're not in the room. Not just looks at it. He stares at it, like he's measuring himself for it. And on Thursday, when you were in the city, he spent 40 minutes pacing outside your study. He was on a burner phone. He kept looking over his shoulder. He didn't see me because I was dusting the high shelves behind the drapes." Lorenzo's expression froze. The relaxed, tired man vanished, replaced instantly by the cold-blooded killer she had seen at the club. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Victor has been with me for 15 years, Lorenzo said softly, dangerously. "Are you accusing my underboss of treason?" "Beatrice, I'm not accusing anyone of anything." Beatrice panicked, backing up against the stove. "You asked what I saw. I'm just a fat maid to them. Mr. Costa, they don't censor themselves when I'm around because they don't think I matter. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything." Lorenzo stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. Then he stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't pull a gun. He simply turned and walked toward the door. "Go to sleep, Beatrice," he threw over his shoulder, "and keep baking. You're useful." For the next week, the tension in the estate was palpable. Lorenzo increased his security detail. He started keeping Beatrice closer to him, having her bring him coffee in his study, having her sit quietly in the corner, reading a book while he held lower-level meetings. The men hated it. Victor especially cast venomous glares at Beatrice, disgusted that the boss was keeping a slob in his inner sanctum. But Lorenzo was testing her theory. He was using her as a human lie detector, a piece of the furniture that could report back to him. What started as an act of twisted pity was slowly transforming into a bizarre reliance. She was the only person in his world who didn't want his money, his power, or his life. She just wanted to survive. But Beatrice's observation had come too late. The gears of betrayal were already turning, and the safety of the estate was an illusion. It happened on a Friday evening. Lorenzo had dismissed most of his personal guard for the night, keeping only Leo and 2 other men stationed at the front gates. Victor had requested a private late-night sit-down in the study to discuss a delicate shipment coming through the docks. Beatrice was in the kitchen washing dishes. The house was unnervingly quiet. She felt a deep, sickening knot in her stomach, a primal instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. She dried her hands and walked down the long carpeted hallway toward the residential wing. As she passed the grand foyer, she noticed the heavy oak front doors were slightly ajar. The security keypad on the wall, usually glowing a steady green, was entirely dark. The system had been cut. Beatrice's breath hitched. She pressed her heavy frame against the wall, peering around the corner. 2 men in tactical black gear holding suppressed submachine guns were silently slipping through the front doors. They weren't Lorenzo's men. They were wearing red armbands, the mark of the rival Russo family. Victor had sold him out. He had opened the gates from the inside. Panic, hot and blinding, surged through Beatrice's veins. Her immediate instinct was to run. She knew the back servants' corridors. She could slip out through the laundry room, disappear into the woods, and run until her lungs burst. She owed Lorenzo Costa nothing. He was a monster who had kidnapped her, kept her as a pet, and terrorized the city. She took a step toward the servants' hall, but then she pictured Lorenzo sitting in his study. She remembered the rare moments of quiet in the kitchen, the exhausted man who had eaten her cookies, and for a brief moment treated her like a human being instead of a piece of trash. She remembered that he was the only reason she wasn't rotting in a barrel. "I'm going to die," she thought, tears springing to her eyes. "I am a fat, stupid girl, and I am going to die." Gritting her teeth, Beatrice turned away from the exit. She kicked off her shoes so her footsteps wouldn't be heard, and ran as fast as her heavy body would allow toward Lorenzo's study at the end of the east corridor. She rounded the corner just in time to see Victor stepping out of the study, locking the door from the outside with a heavy brass key. He turned, signaling to the 2 armed assassins marching down the hall. "He's poisoned!" Victor hissed to the men. "Slipped a paralytic in his scotch. He can't walk. Finish him off, make it look like the Russos did it, and then burn the room. We take over tonight." Victor hurried down the opposite hallway, leaving the 2 assassins to finish the bloody work. Beatrice was standing in the shadows of an alcove, her heart hammering loud enough to deafen her. She looked around frantically for a weapon. There was nothing but an antique solid bronze statue of a horse on a display pedestal next to her. It weighed at least 40 pounds. The first assassin stepped up to the study door. He raised his foot and kicked the heavy wood inward, splintering the frame. He stepped inside, raising his weapon. "Costa!" The assassin sneered. Inside, Lorenzo was slumped in his leather chair, his face pale sweat beading on his forehead. The paralytic was taking hold, rendering his legs useless. He reached weakly for the gun in his desk drawer, but his fingers were numb. He looked up at the barrel of the assassin's gun, realizing this was the end. He had been outplayed. Suddenly, a massive blur of movement exploded through the doorway. Beatrice didn't just run. She threw her entire 260-pound body forward with the momentum of a runaway freight train. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream, raising the 40-pound bronze horse high above her head. The assassin only had time to turn his head in confusion. Crack! Beatrice brought the bronze statue down with horrifying force, smashing it directly into the side of the assassin's head. The man's skull crumpled under the weight of the metal and her sheer physical momentum. But she didn't stop there. Using her heavy frame, she tackled the falling man, her massive weight driving him violently into the mahogany bookshelf. The wood splintered. The assassin hit the floor completely unconscious, his gun sliding across the Persian rug. Beatrice. Lorenzo choked out his eyes wide with absolute shock. The second assassin standing in the hallway recovered from the shock of seeing his partner crushed by the plus-size maid. He raised his submachine gun, pointing it directly at Lorenzo's chest. Beatrice didn't think. She acted on pure, desperate instinct. As the assassin pulled the trigger, Beatrice threw herself over Lorenzo's paralyzed body. She blanketed him entirely, her wide back and thick shoulders completely shielding the Mafia Boss from the doorway. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The suppressed bullets tore through the air. The first one missed, shattering a glass decanter. The second grazed Beatrice's thick upper arm, tearing through flesh and muscle. She screamed in agony, the burning pain radiating through her shoulder, but she clamped her eyes shut and pressed her heavy body tighter against Lorenzo. "Get off me," Lorenzo roared, struggling weakly against her weight, horrified that she was taking his bullets. "Shut up," Beatrice sobbed, bleeding onto his crisp white shirt. Before the assassin could fire a fatal volley, a deafening roar echoed down the hallway. Leo, covered in blood and holding a pump-action shotgun, stepped into view. He didn't hesitate. He blew the second assassin backward with a single devastating shot to the chest. Silence fell over the study, save for the ringing in their ears and Beatrice's ragged, pained sobbing. Slowly, painfully, Beatrice rolled off Lorenzo, clutching her bleeding, massive arm. She slumped against the desk, her face pale, the adrenaline fading to leave her trembling violently. Lorenzo, fighting the paralytic, managed to drag himself upright using the edge of the desk. He looked at the dead assassin, then at the bronze statue, and finally at the bleeding, overweight woman crying on his floor. She had done it. The invisible girl, the pathetic stray he had taken in solely out of a fleeting moment of pity, had just thrown herself into the line of fire. She had used the very body society mocked her for to crush a trained killer and shield him from death. Lorenzo reached down his trembling hand, grabbing Beatrice's uninjured arm, gripping it tight. The cold sociopathic wall he had built around his heart for 20 years suddenly cracked. "Leo," Lorenzo commanded, his voice raspy, but echoing with a terrifying protective fury. "Lock down the estate. Nobody leaves. Call the doctor for Beatrice, and then bring me Victor." He looked back down at the weeping girl, his dark eyes blazing with a dangerous new emotion. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was his savior. And heaven help the men who had just made her bleed. The sharp, biting sting of the needle pulling through flesh finally grounded Beatrice. She hissed, her eyes flying open to the harsh, sterile lights of the estate's underground medical bay. Dr. Harrison, an older, weary man who had spent 3 decades pulling bullets out of the Costa family, tied off the suture on her upper arm. "You're lucky, Miss Gallagher," he muttered, snipping the thread. The bullet grazed the deltoid, took a chunk of tissue, but missed the bone and the brachial artery entirely. A 1/4 of an inch to the left, and you would have bled out on the study floor. Beatrice stared blankly at her heavily bandaged arm. The adrenaline had completely evaporated. leaving behind a cold, hollow ache and a terrifying realization of what she had just done. She had killed a man. She had crushed a human skull with a bronze horse. The violent, sickening crunch echoed on a loop in her mind. She wasn't lucky, Doc. She was built for it. Beatrice flinched. Sitting in the corner of the room, still fighting off the lingering tremors of the paralytic, was Lorenzo. He was sitting in a leather medical recliner, his bespoke shirt ruined with her blood. His dark eyes were locked onto her, burning with an intensity she had never seen before. The cold, calculated Mafia Boss was gone. In his place was something feral, deeply possessive, and utterly fixated. Dr. Harrison packed his bag, nodded respectfully to Lorenzo, and slipped out of the room, leaving the two of them alone. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Beatrice instinctively tried to shrink into herself, pulling her hospital gown tighter over her wide hips and heavy chest. Even now, having saved his life, she felt the agonizing sting of vulnerability. "I'm sorry about your carpet, Mr. Costa," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was a stupid, absurd thing to say, but her brain was short-circuiting. Lorenzo let out a low, rough laugh that sounded more like a growl. He pushed himself out of the chair. His legs were still unsteady, but he forced himself to walk across the room until he stood directly in front of her. "My carpet," he repeated softly. He reached out his warm, rough fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of sweaty brown hair behind her ear. The touch sent a violent shiver down Beatrice's spine. "You threw yourself over a paralyzed man, took a 9mm round, meant for my heart, and you're apologizing for the rug." I didn't know what else to do," she stammered, looking down at her lap. "I know I'm just the fat cleaner. I know I'm not supposed to be involved. But Victor, he locked the door. He sold you out." Lorenzo's hand dropped from her hair to grip her chin, tilting her face up. He forced her to meet his gaze. "Listen to me very carefully, Beatrice," Lorenzo said, his voice a dark, commanding rumble. "The fat cleaner died tonight in that study. The invisible girl is gone. The men in my syndicate, the men with six-pack abs and military training, the men I pay thousands of dollars a week to protect me, they folded. Victor, a man who ate at my table for 15 years, handed me to the dogs, and you, a woman society told to hide in the shadows, you became an absolute titan." He stepped closer, his physical presence overwhelming. "You saved the head of the Costa family. From this second forward, you don't wear a uniform. You don't mop floors. You don't bow your head to anyone in this city. You are untouchable. You belong to me, not as a prisoner, but as my savior." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. The fear was still there, but it was twisting into something else. Something warm, dangerous, and intoxicating. The heavy steel door of the medical bay swung open. Leo stepped in, his face a grim mask of fury. He held a bloody encrypted satellite phone in his massive hand. "Boss," Leo grunted. "The perimeter is secure, but Victor is gone. He slipped out through the drainage tunnels under the south lawn before we could lock down the gates. We intercepted a call on this burner. He's headed to the city. He's officially seeking asylum with the Russo family." Lorenzo's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek. The tender moment shattered, replaced by the ruthless calculus of war. "If the Russos take him in, it's a declaration of open war," Lorenzo stated, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "They want the ports. Victor knows my entire distribution network. He knows the schedules." "What's the play?" Leo asked, racking the slide of his pistol out of pure nervous habit. "We burn them down before they can set up," Lorenzo ordered. "Call the capos. I want every soldier on the street by dawn. We hit their fronts. But first," Lorenzo turned his attention back to Beatrice, "move her into the master suite." Leo blinked, caught entirely off guard. The master suite boss? That's your did I stutter, Leo? Lorenzo snapped. She stays in my wing. 2 guards on her door at all times. Nobody gets within 10 feet of her without my explicit permission. Yes, boss. As Leo turned to leave, Lorenzo looked back at Beatrice. The violence in his eyes softened just a fraction. Rest, Beatrice. When you wake up, your life changes. 3 days later, the city of Chicago was bleeding. The news channels were dominated by reports of unprecedented gang violence. A warehouse fire near the Calumet River, a drive-by shooting outside a nightclub on Rush Street, a mysterious explosion at a shipping front on Lakeshore Drive. The Costa and Russo families were tearing the city apart, and Lorenzo was at the center of the hurricane. But inside the fortified walls of the Costa estate, Beatrice was experiencing a metamorphosis. True to his word, Lorenzo had moved her into the master suite, a sprawling, opulent space of dark wood velvet and bulletproof glass. The cheap polyester-made uniforms were burned. In their place, Lorenzo had brought in a private tailor from Michigan Avenue, a terrifyingly precise older Italian woman who didn't blink twice at Beatrice's size. For the first time in her life, Beatrice was draped in clothing designed specifically to worship her body. High-waisted wide-leg trousers in rich charcoal wool, silk blouses in deep emerald greens, and crimsons that accommodated her chest and accentuated her waist. When Beatrice looked in the mirror, she didn't see the pathetic, invisible girl from the velvet room. She saw a woman with weight presence and an undeniable, imposing beauty. But beautiful clothes couldn't mask the anxiety gnawing at her. Lorenzo was losing the war. She sat quietly in the corner of Lorenzo's temporary command center, the massive dining room now littered with blueprints, encrypted laptops, and half-empty bottles of whiskey. Lorenzo stood at the head of the table, flanked by Leo and 3 heavily tattooed capos. Lorenzo looked ragged. He hadn't slept in 3 days. We hit their harbor shipments, but it didn't slow them down. One of the capos, a man named Sal, argued, slamming his fist on the mahogany table. Victor knew we'd go for the docks. He's hiding, boss. He's directing the Russos from a hole in the ground, and until we find him, we're just swatting flies. He has to be communicating with them, Lorenzo rasped, rubbing his temples. Where is the command post? The Russos don't use digital comms for high-level hits. They use runners and safe houses. Where is Victor? The men argued in circles, shouting over one another, tossing out locations of known Russo fronts, strip clubs, meatpacking plants, auto shops. From her plush velvet chair in the corner, Beatrice listened. Her mind raced. She was used to being the fly on the wall. She remembered every hushed conversation she had overheard while dusting shelves and scrubbing floors. She remembered Victor. She closed her eyes, filtering out the shouting capos, and transported herself back to a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks ago. She was polishing the brass fixtures in the hallway outside Victor's private quarters. Victor had been on the phone. The prime ribs are dry, Beatrice whispered into the loud room. Nobody heard her over Sal's shouting. She took a deep breath, clutching the armrests of her chair, and forced herself to do something she had never done in her life. She demanded attention. The prime ribs are dry, Beatrice said, her voice ringing out loudly, carrying a shocking weight. The room instantly fell dead silent. 4 ruthless mafia enforcers stopped mid-sentence and slowly turned to stare at the plus-size woman in the emerald silk blouse. Sal frowned, looking deeply offended. What the hell is she talking about? Boss, why is the maid in the war room? Lorenzo shot Sal a look so lethally cold that the capo physically took a step back. Speak, Beatrice, Lorenzo commanded, softly giving her his full, undivided attention. Beatrice stood up. Her legs trembled slightly, But she held her ground, her expensive clothes giving her a strange armor. Before all of this happened, Beatrice started looking directly at Lorenzo. I was cleaning the hall outside Victor's room. He was on a burner phone. He was furious. He said, "I told you the drop is at the steakhouse. The prime ribs are dry. We need the imported cuts." I thought he was just complaining about his dinner. "So he likes steak," Sal scoffed. "Who cares?" He wasn't talking about dinner. Beatrice said, her confidence growing as the pieces clicked together. "Victor has an ulcer. He doesn't eat red meat. He hasn't touched a steak in the 3 months I've worked here. He eats grilled chicken and rice." Lorenzo's eyes widened slightly. He was using a code. "Yes," Beatrice nodded. "The prime ribs are dry." He was talking about money or product. "But where was the drop?" He said, "the steak house." "But you own the major steak houses in our territory." "Gibson's," Leo interjected suddenly, his eyes lighting up. "Gibson's Bar and Steak House on Rush Street. But that's neutral territory. The commission strictly forbids any family from conducting business or spilling blood there. It's a safe zone." Lorenzo smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile that sent a shiver down the spines of his men. "Exactly. It's neutral territory. It's the one place in Chicago where I wouldn't dare send heavily armed men to kick down the doors. It's the perfect place to hide in plain sight." Lorenzo walked around the massive table, ignoring his capos, and stopped right in front of Beatrice. He looked down at her, not with pity, not with gratitude, but with sheer, unadulterated awe. "You see everything," he murmured, raising a hand to cup her cheek. His thumb traced her cheekbone, his touch startlingly gentle for a man covered in the blood of his enemies. "My beautiful, brilliant ghost." The capos stared at the floor, distinctly uncomfortable, with the raw, intimate tension practically radiating from their boss and the heavyset woman. Lorenzo turned back to his men, his demeanor instantly snapping back to the ruthless warlord. "Leo, gather the ghost squad. We don't kick the front door down at Gibson's. We take the private dining room through the kitchen service elevator. Suppressed weapons only. No collateral damage. We bring Victor out alive." Lorenzo's eyes darkened to pitch black. "I want to carve him up myself." As the men scrambled to execute the orders, Lorenzo lingered for a moment. He looked back at Beatrice, who was breathing heavily, her cheeks flushed. "When this is over tonight," Lorenzo said, his voice a low vibration that Beatrice felt in her chest, "we are going to have a very long conversation about your future, Beatrice. You saved my life with your hands. Now you're saving my empire with your mind. You are never leaving my side." He turned and strode out of the room, leaving Beatrice standing in the center of the Mafia war room. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was becoming the queen of the underworld. But out on the streets, Victor was smart, and a cornered rat is always the most dangerous. The wait was agonizing. For 2 hours, Beatrice sat on the edge of the sprawling, velvet-draped king bed in the master suite, staring blindly at the muted television screen. The silence of the estate was heavier than the storm outside. Lorenzo had vanished into the bowels of the house, preparing the soundproof interrogation rooms constructed beneath the wine cellar. At exactly 1:45 a.m., Lorenzo's heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor. The heavy oak doors swung open. He had stripped off his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. "Leo just pulled into the garage," Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The Ghost Squad bypassed Gibson's main floor entirely. They took Victor out through the basement delivery bay in a laundry cart. The Russos don't even know he's gone yet." Beatrice stood up, her uninjured hand gripping the silk of her emerald blouse. Is he alive?" He has all his fingers and toes for now, Lorenzo replied, his eyes dark and entirely devoid of mercy. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. He reached out his knuckles, brushing lightly against the thick bandage on her upper arm. I want you downstairs, Beatrice. Beatrice's breath caught. In the basement, Lorenzo. I don't want to see you torture him. I can't stomach that. I am not asking you to watch a slaughter, Lorenzo said softly, cupping her face. I am asking you to stand by my side. Victor thought he could murder me, steal my empire, and step over your dead body to do it. He needs to look into the eyes of the woman who broke his master plan. He needs to know that a woman he considered garbage is the architect of his demise. Walk with me. Swallowing her fear, Beatrice nodded. The basement of the Costa estate was a stark contrast to the opulent luxury above. It was pure utilitarian concrete, smelling faintly of bleach copper and damp earth. When they entered the interrogation room, the temperature dropped. Victor was strapped to a heavy steel chair bolted to the floor. His sleek, custom-tailored suit was ruined, stained with sweat and grease from the laundry cart. His lip was split, bleeding down his chin, but his eyes were wide, manic, and defiant. Leo stood in the corner, idly spinning a heavy steel wrench in his hands. When the heavy metal door clicked shut, Victor looked up. He sneered at Lorenzo, but when his eyes landed on Beatrice, standing tall in her elegant clothes, his face twisted into a mask of pure, venomous disgust. You brought the maid, Victor laughed, blood bubbling on his teeth. What is she going to mop up, my blood boss? Or did you just bring her down here for a snack? God, look at her. You always had strange tastes, Lorenzo, but keeping a fat pig as a pet is a new low. Before Beatrice could even flinch at the cruelty of the words, Lorenzo moved. He crossed the room in a fraction of a second, his fist connecting with Victor's jaw with the sickening crack of a baseball bat hitting a fastball. Victor's head snapped back, his chair rattling violently against the concrete bolts. Say another word about her, Lorenzo whispered, lethally grabbing Victor by the blood-soaked lapels of his suit, and I will have Leo remove your tongue with a pair of pliers. She is the queen of this family. You are the dirt beneath her shoes. Victor spat a glob of blood onto the concrete, grinning darkly. Go ahead. Kill me. It doesn't change anything. I gave the Russos the shipping schedules. But more importantly, Lorenzo, I gave them the ledgers for Continental Trust. Lorenzo's grip on Victor's suit tightened. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet even further. You're bluffing, Lorenzo growled. The Continental accounts are strictly offline. The keys are in a physical safety deposit box. Not anymore. Victor wheezed, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. I copied the digital keys 3 days ago. Carmine Russo has them now. If I don't check in by sunrise, he forwards the keys to the FBI field office in Chicago. Every front company, every bribed judge, every offshore account you own will be frozen by tomorrow afternoon. You might kill me, Lorenzo, but your empire dies with me. Silence suffocated the room. Leo stopped spinning the wrench, looking nervously at Lorenzo. If Victor was telling the truth, the Costa family was effectively dead. The FBI would seize everything, and Lorenzo would spend the rest of his life in a federal supermax prison. Victor leaned forward as far as the straps would allow. So here's the deal, boss. You put me on a private jet to South America. You wire 10 million into a blind account. And maybe, just maybe, I tell Carmine to burn the keys. Lorenzo looked like a caged tiger. The veins in his neck bulged, his fists trembling with the sheer effort of not snapping Victor's neck on the spot. He had been backed into a corner. He's lying. The voice was soft, but it echoed loudly against the concrete walls. Lorenzo, Victor, and Leo all turned to look at Beatrice. She stepped out of the shadows near the door, her dark eyes fixed on Victor. She wasn't trembling anymore. The sight of the man who had ordered men to shoot her in the back ignited a cold, hard fury in her chest. "What did you say, you stupid cow?" Victor hissed. Beatrice ignored him, looking directly at Lorenzo. "He doesn't have the digital keys to the Continental accounts. He couldn't have copied them 3 days ago." Lorenzo frowned, stepping back from Victor. "How do you know that, Beatrice?" "Because 3 days ago he was running for his life," Beatrice said, her voice steady and clinical. "But before that, when he was planning his coup, I watched him." She turned her gaze back to Victor, walking slowly toward him. The imposing physical space she occupied, combined with the expensive tailored clothing, made her look incredibly formidable. "You think I'm invisible, Victor?" Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a newfound, terrifying authority. "You thought I was just the fat girl scrubbing your toilets. You didn't realize that while I was on my hands and knees polishing the baseboards in your office, I could see exactly what you were taping to the underside of your bottom desk drawer." Victor's face went entirely pale. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. "Shut up," he whispered. "It's a black USB drive." Beatrice continued, turning to Lorenzo. "He didn't give anything to Carmine Russo. He wouldn't hand over his only leverage to a rival boss. He kept it for himself as an insurance policy. It's taped beneath the bottom drawer of his desk in the East Wing." Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He looked at Leo. "Tear his office apart. Bring me the drive." Leo sprinted out of the room. For 5 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the basement was Victor's ragged, panicked breathing. He pulled desperately at his restraints, his eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing that the invisible woman he had mocked his entire life had just driven the final nail into his coffin. The heavy door slammed open. Leo walked in, holding up a small black USB flash drive. "Exactly where she said it was, boss." Leo grinned, a feral display of teeth. Lorenzo took the drive, slipping it into his pocket. He looked at Victor, the last shred of mercy evaporating from his soul. Then Lorenzo turned his back on the traitor and walked over to Beatrice. He took her uninjured hand, raising it to his lips and kissing her knuckles. "You," Lorenzo murmured, his eyes blazing with dark adoration, "are magnificent." He led Beatrice out of the cold, damp room. As they walked up the concrete stairs, Victor began to scream, begging for a deal, begging for his life. Lorenzo paused at the top of the stairs. He looked back at Leo, who was picking up the heavy steel wrench again. "Leo," Lorenzo commanded, his voice echoing down into the dark. "Take out the trash." The blood of the underworld washed away over the next 2 weeks, leaving a terrifying new world order in its wake. Without Victor's insider knowledge, and facing a ruthless, overwhelming assault from Lorenzo's soldiers, the Russo family crumbled. Their warehouses were burned, their captains were compromised, and their territory was swallowed whole by the Costa machine. But the biggest shift wasn't on the streets of Chicago. It was inside the iron gates of the Costa estate. Beatrice was no longer a secret. She was the undeniable, fiercely protected matriarch of the most powerful crime syndicate in the Midwest. The men who used to sneer at her weight now lowered their eyes in absolute reverence when she walked into a room. They had heard the whispers that the boss's woman had taken a bullet for him, that she had crushed an assassin with a bronze statue, and that she had single-handedly broken Victor's blackmail scheme. In the twisted, violent culture of the Mafia, loyalty and brutality were worshipped. Beatrice had displayed both in spades. It was a Friday night, precisely 1 month since Beatrice had spilled her mop bucket in the Velvet Room. Lorenzo had arranged a final sit-down with Carmine Russo at a neutral, highly secure location, a private dining room in a high-rise overlooking Lake Michigan. The purpose was to officially accept the Russos' surrender and absorb their remaining assets. Beatrice stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite. She was wearing a custom-made floor-length gown of midnight black silk. It draped perfectly over her wide hips, cinched at her waist, and featured a plunging neckline that highlighted her heavy, generous curves. A thick diamond choker, a gift from Lorenzo, rested against her collarbone, hiding the faint, fading bruises from the chaotic weeks prior. She stared at her reflection. The terrified, sweaty cleaner was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman who understood her own gravity, her own undeniable power. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Lorenzo rested his chin on her shoulder, looking at her reflection in the glass. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, looking every bit the untouchable king. "You are breathtaking," he murmured, his hands tracing the curve of her hips. "Are you ready for tonight?" Beatrice leaned back against his solid chest. "Is Carmine Rousseau going to be a problem?" "Carmine is a broken old man," Lorenzo said dismissively. "He has no army left. Tonight is just a formality. But I want them to see you. I want every remaining boss in this city to understand that you are the architect of my survival. If they want to speak to me, they respect you first." When they arrived at the high-rise, Lorenzo's heavily armed security detail swept the floor. Lorenzo and Beatrice walked into the private dining room. Carmine Rousseau, a frail man in his late 60s, sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, flanked by his two remaining nervous capos. As Lorenzo approached the table, he didn't pull out the chair to his right for Beatrice. Instead, he pulled out the chair directly at the head of the table, gesturing for her to sit. Carmine Rousseau's eyes widened in shock. "Lorenzo, what is this? We are conducting family business. You bring a woman to the table, and you seat her at the head." Lorenzo's eyes turned instantly black. He placed his hands on the back of Beatrice's chair, leaning forward like a predator about to strike. "Carmine," Lorenzo said, his voice dangerously soft. "The only reason you have a tongue left in your head to ask that stupid question is because Beatrice allowed it. This woman outsmarted your best spy, saved my life, and dismantled your empire from my living room. She isn't just at the table. She owns the table." Beatrice didn't blush. She didn't look away. She folded her hands on the polished wood and fixed Carmine with a cold, unyielding stare. "Mr. Rousseau." Beatrice spoke, her voice smooth and commanding. "We are taking the Calumet River ports, the Rush Street fronts, and 20% of your offshore holdings. In exchange, Lorenzo allows you to retire to Florida with your life. You will sign the paperwork tonight, or my husband will burn the rest of your men to the ground." The room went dead silent. The use of the word husband sent a shockwave through Lorenzo's men, but Lorenzo himself only smiled, a dark, fiercely proud smile. He hadn't put a ring on her finger yet, but in the eyes of the underworld, her declaration was law. Carmine Rousseau looked from the terrifying Mafia Boss to the imposing, brilliantly dangerous plus-size woman beside him. He realized with crushing certainty that the era of the old Mafia was dead. They had been beaten, not by guns, but by a woman they would have never looked twice at on the street. Defeated Carmine reached into his jacket, pulled out a gold pen, and signed the surrender documents. Hours later, back in the fortified safety of the Costa estate, the adrenaline of the victory faded into a heavy, intoxicating heat between them. The bedroom was illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the rain-streaked windows. Lorenzo slowly unzipped the back of Beatrice's black gown, letting the heavy silk pool at her feet. She stood before him, in the dim light, vulnerable but entirely unashamed of her soft, thick stomach, her wide thighs, and the heavy curve of her breasts. Lorenzo dropped to his knees in front of her. He didn't look at her with the pity of a savior or the clinical eye of a boss. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated worship. He pressed his lips to the soft flesh of her stomach, his large hands gripping her wide hips, firmly anchoring himself to her. "You called me your husband," he whispered against her skin, the vibration sending shivers down her spine. "Was I wrong?" Beatrice asked, her fingers threading through his dark hair. Lorenzo stood up, his eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. He swept her off her feet easily, carrying her heavy frame to the massive bed. "You are never wrong, my queen," he murmured, his lips crashing down on hers, claiming her with a desperate, consuming passion. The Chicago underworld would tell legends about the fall of the Russo family for decades. They would whisper about the violent, bloody war and the ruthless cunning of Lorenzo Costa. But the greatest, most terrifying legend of all would be the story of the heavy-set, invisible cleaning girl who spilled a bucket of bleach, took a bullet for a monster, and rose from the shadows to rule the city with an iron, unbreakable grip. She was no longer a ghost. She was the queen, and she would never be ignored again. Beatrice Gallagher started as a ghost in the Chicago underworld, a terrified cleaner, sweeping up the sins of ruthless men. But the night she lifted that bronze statue to save Lorenzo Costa, she proved that true strength isn't measured by a tailored suit, a sculpted physique, or the expectations of a cruel society. It is measured by the raw courage to stand when everyone else expects you to fall. In the very real, often hidden power dynamics of organized crime, Syndicate's loyalty is the rarest currency, and Beatrice paid in blood. She didn't just survive the vicious, male-dominated world of the Mafia, she completely reshaped it. Lorenzo didn't just find a queen, he found his ultimate shield and his greatest equal in the most unexpected place. Their reign over the city wasn't just built on fear, but on an unbreakable bond forged in the darkest of shadows. Did Beatrice's incredible heart-pounding journey from an invisible maid to the untouchable queen of the Costa Empire leave you absolutely speechless? If you were captivated by this thrilling tale of betrayal, fierce loyalty, and a plus-size heroine who refused to back down, smash that like button. Right now, share this video with your friends who love an intense protective mafia romance where the underdog comes out on top. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the darkest, most dramatic romance stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have risked it all to save Lorenzo? Or would you have run out the back door? Let us know your thoughts.